The air was thick with anticipation as Goldberry captivated the crowd, her voice a steady beacon of hope. But suddenly, a shadow crossed the room. The doors swung open with a fierce bang, and officers in uniform marched in, eyes fixed on Gold. The audience fell silent, whispers frozen in shock. Before she could react, the officers seized her, voices cold and final. "This is an arrest. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you powerful stories that dive deep into courage, justice, and resilience. If you love tales that touch the heart and inspire change, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, and remember to share your thoughts. Every subscriber boosts our inspiration to bring these tales to life. Join us today." Goldberry stood at the podium, her words flowing with the grace and conviction that had empowered thousands. She was a guest speaker at an event on women's reproductive rights, one she had helped organize for years. The room was filled with women, young and old, mothers, students, and activists, all drawn by her passion and sincerity. Gold had dedicated her life to helping women understand their bodies and claim their rights, sharing knowledge, and offering support through her NGO. She had seen the consequences of neglect and shame, and she had vowed to be a voice for change. Then, without warning, the doors burst open. The room fell silent, eyes turned toward the entrance as a squad of officers in full uniform stormed in. Shocked murmurs rippled through the audience as the officers headed straight for Gold. She looked around, disoriented, as they reached her, gripping her arms and pulling her from the podium. "This is an arrest," one officer declared, his voice cold and unyielding. Gold's heart pounded. She tried to hold her head high, but the humiliation was inescapable. The crowd looked on in horror, some reaching out to her, others in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. Flashes from phones and cameras went off as the officers led her out in handcuffs, the accusations ringing in her ears. "Goldberry, you are under arrest for illegal abortion practices that resulted in the death of a patient." The entire scene was mortifying. Gold felt stripped of her dignity, her accomplishments, her life's work, reduced to nothing in an instant. She knew these accusations were lies, a ploy to bring her down. But here she was, dragged before the world as though she were a criminal. Now she sat in a packed courtroom, facing a sea of eyes that looked at her with suspicion and judgment. Whispers echoed throughout the room, many laced with prejudice and distrust. Some called her a murderer, others a disgrace. Gold kept her gaze steady, her face composed, though her hands clenched tightly under the table. She was determined to show no fear. The judge entered, his heavy steps echoing in the silent courtroom. Judge Edward Carlisle was notorious. He wore his prejudices like badges, his rulings harsh and unforgiving, particularly against those he deemed morally unsuitable. Gold knew he despised her, a black woman who championed reproductive rights, who stood up for what he viewed as an unacceptable cause. His gaze fell on her with a mixture of scorn and satisfaction, as if finally able to crush a long-standing thorn in his side. "Goldberry," he said, drawing out her name with a cold disdain. "You stand accused of facilitating an illegal abortion that caused the tragic death of a young woman. How do you plead?" Gold took a deep breath, her voice calm and clear. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Judge Carlisle raised an eyebrow, almost smirking. He didn't believe her innocence. He wasn't interested in it. To him, Gold represented everything he despised. A woman challenging the system, one who spoke of choices he deemed wrong, one who stood proudly where he believed she had no right to stand. The prosecutor stepped forward, painting a damning picture of Gold's supposed crime. He spoke of a young woman who had lost her life, claiming it was due to a procedure at Gold's NGO. He described Gold as someone who manipulated vulnerable women, luring them into dangerous decisions. Every word was a lie, twisted to vilify her. Gold felt anger and helplessness building inside her as the prosecutor's words echoed through the room, painting her as a heartless villain. But Gold's resolve remained strong. She knew the truth, and she held on to it like a lifeline. This accusation was a carefully constructed lie by anti-abortion groups who had long resented her work. She had been a target for years, and she'd expected this battle at some point, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of it, the sheer injustice. As she sat, enduring the hateful glances and whispers, memories flashed through her mind. She remembered her own painful past, the days of silence after an unwanted, coerced encounter that left her with an unplanned pregnancy. That was when she realized how important choice and support were. She had carried that pain, turned it into strength, and dedicated her life to preventing others from feeling the same isolation and fear. Through her NGO, she'd helped women access safe medical advice, supported survivors of violence, and educated communities on reproductive health. She had become a lifeline to women in need, offering comfort and knowledge where society often offered only shame. Her work was her purpose, her penance, and her strength. And yet here she was, facing 5 years in prison for a crime she did not commit. Judge Carlisle's gaze returned to her, as if savoring the thought of silencing her for good. Gold could feel his intention, his need to destroy her reputation, to send a message to anyone who might think of challenging his worldview. But she wouldn't crumble. She couldn't afford to, not for herself, and not for the countless women she had fought for. Gold's lawyer stood to defend her, explaining her lifelong commitment to safe and legal health practices, but the judge barely seemed to listen. His mind was made up. This was about more than justice. This was about silencing her, erasing her influence. As Gold sat, enduring the twisted portrayal of her work, she realized this trial was not just about her. It was about every woman she'd helped, every life she'd touched, and for them, she would not break. Her silence was her armor, her composure her weapon. This was a battle she hadn't chosen, but one she was prepared to face with every ounce of strength she had. In the darkest moments, Gold found herself filled with a fierce, unyielding resolve. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the prosecutor rose, a smug look in his eyes. His sharp, polished voice cut through the silence, each word wrapped in venom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, casting a mocking glance at Gold, "we are here because of a woman who has twisted her so-called mission into something dangerous, reckless, even deadly." Gold felt her heart pound. She kept her gaze steady, though inside she was burning with fear and anger. She had spent her life standing for women's health, giving everything she had to protect those in need. And now, her reputation, her work, everything she believed in was being dismantled before her eyes. The prosecutor continued, weaving a web of lies. He presented witnesses, each one echoing rehearsed lines that painted Gold as a manipulator, a woman who supposedly took advantage of young, vulnerable women. Each testimony was crafted to portray her as heartless, indifferent to the well-being of those she served. One witness, barely able to look at her, claimed that Gold pressured her into an unsafe procedure that left her scared. Another insisted she'd been misled into a decision she would forever regret. Gold's heart ached with every word. These testimonies, she knew, were lies planted by anti-abortion activists who saw her as a threat. They twisted everything she'd stood for, everything she'd built, into a nightmare, a grotesque version of the truth. But the jury listened intently, hanging onto every poisoned word, while her supporters in the back row looked on with anguish and disbelief. Gold clenched her hands in her lap, feeling trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She thought of the women she'd helped, of the young girls who had come to her broken and desperate, finding comfort and strength in the support her NGO provided. Her heart was breaking, not only for herself but for them. If she were gone, who would they turn to? Her life's work, her purpose, was crumbling under the weight of lies. In a moment of quiet, Gold's lawyer rose to speak. He delivered a passionate defense, detailing her decades of service, the countless lives she had uplifted. He described her as a protector, a woman who knew the pain of loneliness and fear firsthand, and who had dedicated herself to making sure no other woman felt the same. He presented evidence that the accusations were a setup, a ploy by anti-abortion groups to silence a powerful voice in the community. But Judge Carlyle's expression was unchanged. He leaned back in his chair, eyes cold, barely listening. To him, Gold was already guilty. In his mind, her beliefs alone were a crime. Finally, the judge struck his gavel, signaling the end of the trial. The tension was so thick it was nearly tangible, and every eye in the room was fixed on him. Gold held her breath, praying that somehow, justice would prevail. Goldberry, Judge Carlyle intoned, his voice dripping with disdain. This court finds you guilty on all counts. A gasp rose from Gold's supporters, a swell of disbelief and grief. Gold felt her knees weaken. She tried to hold herself together, but the words hit her like physical blows. She was guilty. The very system she had trusted had turned against her, accepting lies over the truth, hatred over compassion. Judge Carlyle continued, his voice stern and unwavering. Given the gravity of your actions and the lives you have impacted so recklessly, I sentence you to 5 years in prison. Gold's heart sank, the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could barely process what she was hearing. 5 years. 5 years away from her work, her mission, her life. She felt as though everything she had fought for had been ripped away in an instant. As the bailiff approached her, Gold felt a mixture of emotions tearing her apart. Rage at the lies that had ensnared her, sorrow for the women she had promised to protect, and fear for the future. Her supporters shouted out, begging the judge to reconsider, but their cries fell on deaf ears. Judge Carlyle's face remained as cold as stone. The bailiff placed handcuffs around her wrists, the metallic snap echoing in the silent room. The humiliation was overwhelming. She wanted to scream, to cry, but she held her head high, determined not to let them see her break. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. As she was led away, her eyes met the faces of her supporters, their expressions etched with pain and horror. She had lost everything, her freedom, her reputation, her chance to continue helping those who needed her most. The betrayal was absolute, the devastation complete. Yet even in the depths of her despair, a spark remained. She knew the truth, and deep down, she clung to the hope that someday, somehow, it would come to light. She wouldn't give up. She couldn't, not for herself, and certainly not for the women she had vowed to protect. The cold steel of the prison bars pressed into Gold's back as she sank to the ground, her heart heavy with despair. Days had passed since her sentencing, but the pain of betrayal felt as raw as ever. She had dedicated her life to helping women, yet here she was, trapped behind bars, her reputation shattered. She wondered how her life's work could have been twisted so cruelly, how justice could turn so blind. Meanwhile, in the marble hallways of the city's highest court, a man sat at his desk, poring over the files of her case. Chief Justice Malcolm Hayes, known throughout the legal world for his fairness and integrity, couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had gripped him since he'd come across Gold's case. It wasn't just the severity of her sentence, or the unusual fervor in the prosecution's arguments. There was something deeper, something wrong. As he flipped through the pages, reading testimonies and reviewing evidence, painful memories began to surface. Memories he had buried long ago. His younger sister, the one person he'd ever felt truly protective of, had suffered a tragic fate years before. Caught in a time when laws were even stricter, she had faced an unwanted pregnancy with nowhere to turn. The shame, the secrecy, the desperate, unsafe procedure she'd undergone to try and protect herself, all of it had ended in heartbreak. She hadn't survived the ordeal, leaving an emptiness in his life that had never healed. The Chief Justice hadn't spoken about her to anyone in years. His grief had fueled his commitment to the law, to fairness, and to the quiet belief that women deserved safety, not shame, when faced with such decisions. And now, as he looked at Goldberry's case, he saw the same forces at play: the cruel restrictions, the judgment, the indifference to the lives of women who simply wanted a choice. He knew, deep down, that this was more than just a case. It was a cry for justice. Determined, he ordered a covered investigation. using his influence to dig into the case's foundations without alerting Judge Carlisle or the anti-abortion groups who had so eagerly sought Gould's downfall. The days that followed were filled with shocking revelations. Witnesses admitted to being coerced, pressured into giving false statements that painted Gould as a villain. Evidence had been tampered with, and several key pieces of information had been fabricated by those eager to discredit her work and silence her voice. One particular detail shook the Chief Justice deeply: the patient's death. The very basis of Gould's sentencing was unrelated to Gould's ego. The young woman had suffered from an unrelated medical condition that anti-abortion activists had twisted to blame Gould, using her as a scapegoat in a merciless scheme to discredit her influence in the community. The Chief Justice's resolve hardened. He would not let this stand. He worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence he could, determined to bring the truth to light. And finally, armed with the findings, he strode into the courtroom where Judge Carlisle presided. The crowd murmured in surprise, their whispers filling the room as the Chief Justice, usually far removed from everyday cases, took his place in front of the bench. Judge Carlisle's face twisted in surprise, and for the first time, unease. The Chief Justice's presence alone was enough to shift the energy in the room, an undeniable authority that even Carlisle dared not challenge. With a voice steady and unyielding, the Chief Justice revealed the truth. The tampering, the coercion, the twisted lies that had framed Gould and shattered her life. One by one, he exposed the fabricated testimonies, the pressure tactics, and the false evidence, leaving no doubt that Gould had been the victim of a setup. Gasps filled the courtroom as the truth unraveled. Gould sat, her heart pounding, as the words washed over her. She felt both relieved and overwhelmed, barely daring to believe that justice was finally coming. The Chief Justice's words felt like a lifeline, pulling her out of the dark depths she had been cast into. Finally, the Chief Justice turned to Judge Carlisle. His voice cut through the silence. "Given the miscarriage of justice in this case, I overturn Goldberry's sentence and order her immediate release." The color drained from Judge Carlisle's face. His carefully constructed mask of authority cracked as he realized he had been exposed, not just as a judge with biases, but as a tool of corruption. He watched, helpless, as Gould was set free, a public apology issued to her, acknowledging the wrongs that had been done. Gould stepped out of the courtroom a free woman, her head held high. The weight of injustice was lifting, replaced by the resolve to continue her work, stronger than ever. She looked back, her gaze meeting Judge Carlisle's, and saw the shock and defeat in his eyes. His power, his hatred, his twisted version of justice, all of it lay in ruins. As she walked out into the light, Gould knew that while her battle was not over, she had an ally in the Chief Justice. The system that had once betrayed her had begun to change, and with it, the lives of countless women she had vowed to protect would be better for it. Goldberry's case became the spark that lit a fire of change. As news of the Chief Justice's intervention spread, the story reached far beyond her small town, capturing national attention. People were shocked not only by the corruption in her trial, but by the injustice faced by women everywhere seeking control over their own bodies. Gould's story laid bare the need for a just and compassionate approach to reproductive rights, and with it, calls for reform echoed across the nation. The Chief Justice, now a quiet but resolute supporter of Gould's mission, felt the urgency of the moment. Seeing how Gould had been unjustly targeted for her work opened his eyes to the system's deep-seated flaws. He pushed for changes, leading efforts to legalize safe medical abortions and make preventative health education accessible to all. His personal tragedy and his witnessing of Gould's struggle gave him the moral conviction to act, knowing that reform was not just necessary, it was long overdue. As laws began to shift, Gould was finally free to return to her work, and she did so with renewed determination. She became more than just an advocate. She became a symbol of resilience and justice. Standing before crowds in schools, community centers, and rallies, She spoke with raw honesty about her journey, her battle, and her commitment to ensure no other woman would have to face what she had. Her voice was steady and powerful, inspiring others to listen, learn, and take action. Gold's once small NGO grew into a formidable organization, with women and men volunteering from all corners of the community, eager to support her cause. Young girls saw her as a role model, a woman who had faced the worst and still fought for others. She worked tirelessly to provide sexual health education, teach young women about their rights, and advocate for accessible health care. Her journey and her work became a rallying cry for change, drawing others to her mission. Women who had previously feared judgment found courage in her story, and slowly the community began to shift in perspective. Even those who had once doubted her began to see the truth. Goldberry was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every woman who had ever been silenced, every girl who had ever felt ashamed, every mother who had ever felt powerless. Gold's efforts empowered women to speak openly about their rights, their bodies, and their choices without fear or shame. The Chief Justice continued his advocacy, lending his influence to support Gold's mission. The legal system, once a tool of oppression in her case, began to change from within. Laws were reformed, barriers removed, and awareness campaigns promoted the importance of reproductive rights. With this shift came a greater public understanding of women's health and the critical importance of choice and safety. As for Judge Carlisle, his reputation crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. He faced backlash from every corner of the community and beyond, his history of biased rulings scrutinized in the light of day. With pressure mounting and respect for him eroded, he was finally forced to resign, his once powerful voice silenced. The system that had enabled him to punish the innocent now stood against him. Gold's victory was more than just her freedom. It was the beginning of lasting change. She had taken her darkest experience and turned it into a beacon of hope, a symbol of justice. The town, once divided and suspicious, now saw her as a hero, a warrior who had fought for what was right. Her strength inspired a movement, proving that justice, though delayed, can indeed triumph when courage meets conviction. Goldberry had not just won her freedom. She had changed the course of her community's future, igniting a movement that would ensure others could walk the path to justice without fear. Thank you for watching. We're so grateful to share these stories with you. Before you go, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments your thoughts and where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to keep bringing you these heartfelt tales. Don't miss out on our next story. Subscribe and stay connected.